Andy Warhol rose from humble beginnings to become a successful and in-demand commercial artist in New York in the 1950s, producing quirky illustrations and advertisements for magazines, record labels, and high-end fashion stores. But it was the 60s when he really came into his own. He was radical, experimental, uninhibited, scandalous, shaking up the rarefied world of fine art with his disarmingly simple yet memorable images, a world which at first wasn't quite sure if it wanted him. In the factory, his crazy, collaborative, creative melting pot of a studio, he expanded into rock music, film, sculpture, multimedia, and being himself. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Professor Graeme Yorston, and today we're exploring the life and extraordinary mind of one of the most iconic figures of 20th century art, Andy Warhol. In part one, we trace his journey from the humblest of beginnings in Pittsburgh to being a successful commercial artist in the Big Apple. In this second part, we pick up the story at the start of the swinging 60s. Warhol is 31, confident, daring, and at the height of his creative powers. In August 1960, he moved into the townhouse on Lexington Avenue he bought for $60,000. With his mother ensconced in the basement, he was able to use the other floors as studio space and for housing his growing collection of contemporary art by other artists. He continued with his lucrative commercial art, and, following in a long line of artists such as Salvador Dali, he was commissioned to dress the windows of upmarket store Bonwit Teller. But he did much less of this than in the 50s, which allowed him to concentrate on his own work. He was meeting people and enjoying life, but a bit too much partying led to him needing a short stay in hospital for a social disease at the end of the year. In 1961, after seeing some of Lichtenstein's comic strip paintings at the Castelli Gallery, he tried some of his own, making his first forays into pop art with Nancy and the Popeyes. When the gallery declined them, however, because they were too close to Lichtenstein, he asked his friends what he should paint instead, and was told, money, or something you see every day, something that everyone would recognise, like a can of Campbell's soup. And for reasons best known to himself, he also drew celebrity photographer Cecil Beaton's feet. He experimented with carving designs of stamps into gum erasers, and must have liked the result, as he later painted the same subject onto canvas. He was starting to get noticed, and in May 1962 he was featured in an article in Time magazine with his painting Big Campbell's Soup Can with Can Opener (vegetable). And a few months later, he was one of the 7 pop artists featured in the New Realists exhibition at the Sidney Janis Gallery, along with Roy Lichtenstein, James Rosenquist, George Segal, Tom Wesselman, Jim Dine, and Robert Indiana. It so outraged and offended the old guard abstract expressionists who had previously dominated the New York art scene, Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko, and others, that they all resigned from the gallery in protest. Some people date the start of pop art from this period, although others point to earlier works such as Scottish artist Edoardo Paolozzi's I Was a Rich Man's Plaything, dating from 1947, or Richard Hamilton's Just What, as being the first examples of the genre. By this stage, Warhol had discovered silk screen printing, enabling him to mass-produce images in different colours and create his distinctive multiple pictures. In December 1962, he had a solo exhibition at Eleanor Ward's Stable Gallery, which included his gold Marilyn, the Marilyn diptych, 8 other Marilyns, 100 soup cans, 100 Coke bottles, 200 $1 bills, and a red Elvis. Visitors were given their own Warhol ribbon attached to a soup can badge. Also around this time, Warhol met poet John Giorno, who would go on to feature in his first movie, Sleep, a 6-hour, low-quality black and white anti-film of Giorno sleeping. Just sleeping. And sleeping. And sleeping. It didn't exactly set the movie world on fire. Of the 9 people who attended the premiere, 2 walked out, and at a screening in Los Angeles, it almost caused a riot. In early 1963, Warhol rented his first studio outside his home, a leaky old firehouse on East 87th Street. Here he created his Elvis series, 8 Elvises, and Triple Elvis, and a series of Elizabeth Taylor portraits. In May 1963, civil rights protests in Birmingham, Alabama were in the news. Although Warhol generally tried to steer clear of politics, he would sometimes incorporate press photographs into his art, and this event prompted him to produce Pink Race Riot. And later in the year, after the assassination of President Kennedy, he started his Jackie series, juxtaposing images of happiness and grief in 9 Jackies. After a few months, he relocated his studio to East 47th Street and decorated it entirely in tin foil and silver paint, creating The Factory, a gathering place for artists, writers, musicians, and an assortment of eccentric characters and counterculture types. An artistic happening in its own right, The Factory was a microcosm of the New York art world at this time. Different, provocative, edgy. An ideas laboratory for Warhol to try out any new notion that entered his mind. There was colour, of course, lots of it, and very bright too, but also some darker works. The ever-presence of death was an important theme for Warhol, and he created a number of disaster paintings of airplane catastrophes, road traffic accidents, and pictures of an electric chair. He also created his Bellevue pictures, named after a New York psychiatric hospital, and based on a newspaper photograph of a woman who had taken her own life. Not as well known as his other works, critics have never been able to agree on whether these pictures are a perceptive critique on the lurid press coverage of such events that was so common at the time, or just cashing in on other people's misery. My own thoughts are that for Warhol, everything was equally valid as a subject for art. Movie stars, stamps, soup cans, dollar bills, demonstrations, even a dead person on a pavement. Perhaps surprisingly, it was with these works that Warhol ventured across the Atlantic for his first European show in Paris. His work almost came to the attention of the 50 million visitors to the New York World's Fair at Flushing Meadows in 1964. Except it was painted over at the last minute, for reasons which have never been entirely clear. Perhaps someone decided a 20-foot-high picture of criminals didn't reflect the true nature of American society. Who knows? At the Factory, along with his painting and printing, and a lot of partying, Warhol ventured into new, unfamiliar areas. In June 1963, he bought his first cine camera, a 16mm Bolex with motor drive that allowed for a one-shot, 3-minute take. With this and later cameras, he made hundreds of films, lasting from a few minutes to the 25-hour split-screen endurance test 4 stars, which, perhaps not surprisingly, has only ever been screened once. The early ones were grainy black and white experiments in avant-garde minimalism, but later ones were slightly more sophisticated. His split-screen Chelsea Girls, released in 1966, was his most successful movie, grossing $130,000 at the box office. Not bad for a film that cost only $3,000 to make. But reviews were polarised, some positive and encouraging, others vitriolic and scornful. Well-known film critic Rex Reed, for example, describing Chelsea Girls as a 3.5-hour cesspool of vulgarity and talentless confusion, which is about as interesting as the inside of a toilet bowl. Many of Warhol's early films, including Chelsea Girls, can be found on YouTube. I tried watching some of them, but I have to confess I only managed a few minutes. For me, they're like so many of the video installations you see in modern art galleries, just not that interesting. Another of his films, Couch, features the famous red sofa in the factory, on which visitors were invited to do something, with the cameras rolling. Beat writers Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso and Jack Kerouac make an appearance and talk, while others engage in performances of a more active kind. His movies were shown in a few specialist theatres in New York alongside other avant-garde filmmakers, but the explicit nature of many of them, none more so than Blue Movie, often drew the attention of the authorities, and quite a few were confiscated in police raids. Much has been written about the merits or otherwise of Warhol's films, but from the clips I've seen there seems to be a clear continuity with his other work. In that he simply places all aspects of life, the glamorous and the decidedly unglamorous, in front of the viewer. Eating, sleeping, having sex, all are treated in the same way. No story, no commentary, no judgment. Inviting you to watch if you want, but not trying to entice you in any way or entertain you. Many of his films feature people who started hanging out at the factory and who somehow became part of the fixtures and fittings. He would insist on everybody doing a screen test, asking them to sit expressionless and motionless for 3 minutes while he shot a reel on his Bolex. 472 of these survive, including visiting actors, poets and other artists, as well as those more closely connected with the factory. Warhol would often become obsessed with his latest superstar, as he called them, but then just as rapidly lose interest. It seems that everybody knew everybody else in the trendy art and fashion world of New York at this time, and some of his superstars would crop up in magazines, such as this 1965 article in Life magazine featuring models photographed against projections of Warhol's films. There were lots of superstars over the years. Joe D'Alessandro, Viva, Holly Woodlawn, Ultraviolet, Candy Darling, and Jackie Curtis. Some went on to performing careers after Warhol, but others sparkled in their 15 minutes of fame and then faded away just as quickly. None burned more brightly, however, than 21-year-old model Edie Sedgwick. When Warhol bumped into her at a party, he was instantly struck by her beauty and star quality. She had a look that could melt hearts, like Marilyn Monroe, and she shared the same mixture of naivete and cunning, neediness and self-assuredness, innocence and 60s sexiness. Warhol was transfixed. Writing later, he said, "I could see that she had more problems than anyone I'd ever met. So beautiful, but so sick. I was really intrigued." Edie became so much a part of the factory that those who weren't really in the know thought she and Warhol were an item. They often appeared in public together, and she accompanied him on a trip to France. In Paris, he shocked the art world by announcing that he was going to retire from painting, saying, "It's people who are fascinating, and I want to spend all my time being around them, listening to them, and making movies of them." Back in New York, Edie sprayed her hair silver and even started dressing like Warhol. He was fascinated by her. There was just something about her. She was in all of his films until she had the temerity to become interested in Bob Dylan. And then she was gone. Warhol was right about her fragility, though. Over the next few years, she battled a major drug problem and was in and out of psychiatric hospitals before dying at the age of 28 with alcohol and barbiturates in her system. Some of the superstars remained close to Warhol for the rest of his life, especially Brigitte Berlin, artist, Polaroid photographer and obsessive tape recorder of conversations, famous for her so-called tit prints, created by painting, well, I'm sure you can work out how they were created. Berlin continued in the inner circle, appearing in his films and working on Warhol's Interview magazine even after he died. Another unfamiliar territory he entered was music. Warhol had always listened to a wide variety of musical styles, from Wagnerian opera to avant-garde rock, via Hollywood musicals, Elvis Presley, Count Basie, modern classical composer John Cage, and Maria Callas. Over his lifetime, he designed covers for more than 60 albums, from the early 50s right up to his death. But in 1965, radical filmmaker Barbara Rubin introduced him to a talented but little-known rock band, the Velvet Underground, led by Lou Reed. Attracted by their alternativeness, the name after all came from a book about unconventional, for the time anyway, sexual practices, Warhol offered to become the band's manager and suggested they include his latest superstar, German-born singer Nico, on some of their songs. Warhol's profile undoubtedly helped the band gain greater exposure and secure a recording contract, and he didn't try to interfere musically, giving them complete freedom over the sound they created. The band and their hypnotic, improvisational music formed a crucial element of his next new venture, multimedia performance. One of the earliest incarnations of this, Andy Warhol's Uptight, debuted at a dinner for the New York Society for Clinical Psychiatry in January 1966. After several of his films were screened, Warhol then appeared on stage with the Velvet Underground, Nico, Eddie Sedgwick and dancer Gerard Malanga. Then Barbara Rubin went around the audience, thrusting lights and movie cameras into people's faces and asking them incredibly personal questions about their sex lives. As a psychiatrist myself, I can't help feeling some sympathy with the audience. It must have been excruciating to sit through. But at the same time, it would have been a salutary lesson in what it feels like to be put under the spotlight, literally, and have the inner recesses of your most personal experiences dissected. His multimedia show quickly evolved into the exploding plastic inevitable. By all accounts, these were extraordinary events performed across the United States and Canada over the next year, combining live music by the Velvet Underground and Nico, film screenings, and the dancing of Gerard Malanga, Mary Warrenoff, and Ingrid Superstar. Up to 5 film projectors showing different films or different reels of the same film simultaneously, slide projectors sweeping still images around the auditorium, strobe lights, moving spots with coloured gels, and loudspeakers blaring out different tracks at the same time. If all of this sounds a bit trippy, well, yes, there was certainly a lot of drugs around, and the factory was raided by the police on more than one occasion. Warhol himself usually denied using anything, but there are accounts from people who were there who claim otherwise. He did, however, admit to using Obitrol for many years, a combination of amphetamines, including methamphetamine, that was legally prescribed at the time for weight control. In 1966, Warhol produced the Velvet Underground's first album and provided the sleeve art, but he wasn't involved musically besides paying for the studio time. It didn't do particularly well when it was first released, but it has since been hailed as one of the greatest and most influential records of all time. After their first album, however, Warhol and Lou Reed started to disagree about the direction the band should take, and they parted company. In 1967, he relocated his studio to the 6th floor of the Decca building on Union Square, close to Max's Kansas City nightclub, which Warhol and the entire factory gang used to frequent. In 1968, Warhol's silver pillows were utilised by dancer Merce Cunningham in performances of his dance piece Rainforest, with flesh-coloured torn costumes designed by Jasper Johns, after Warhol, who had originally been asked to create these as well, said casually, "Oh, they shouldn't wear any clothes." In March 1968, he had his first solo exhibition in London at the Rowan Gallery, where he showed his Marilyn prints alongside his 13 most wanted men. Throughout the 60s, Warhol's work continued to evolve and ask questions about the nature of art and the way the world could be depicted on canvas and in sculpture and film. But this period of his life came to an abrupt end on the 3rd of June 1968, when radical feminist writer Valerie Solanas shot and almost killed him. Before the shooting, Solanas had been a marginal figure in the factory scene. Author of the Scum Manifesto, that's the Society for the Cutting Up of Men, a radical feminist tract that advocated the eradication of the male gender, she appeared in one of his films, I, a Man. In the lead up to the attack, she had been trying to get her play Up Your Ass produced. When she was rejected by risque publisher Maurice Girodias, she threatened to shoot Warhol to make herself famous. She then went straight to the factory, now at its new location, with a strange look in her eye. She fired twice and missed, then hit Warhol and Mario Amaya. She would have continued, but her gun jammed. Amaya received only minor injuries and was released from the hospital later the same day, but Warhol was seriously wounded. A single bullet went through his lungs, esophagus, spleen, liver and stomach. He was rushed to hospital, but his heart stopped, and he came very close to dying. But thanks to the efforts of his surgeon, Dr. Giuseppe Rossi, he pulled through after 5 hours. He was in hospital for 7 weeks, and still quite weak when he was discharged, and he had to have several further surgeries and wear a surgical corset for the rest of his life. But he never forgot his surgeon, sending him gifts at Christmas every year. Solanas turned herself into the police. Warhol had too much control over my life, was her only explanation. In court, she insisted on representing herself and declared she was right in what she did and had nothing to regret. The judge sent her to Elmhurst Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia and deemed incompetent to stand trial. Transferred to Ward's Island for treatment, she was visited by Edie Sedgwick, who was struggling with her own mental health. She was released in December, but almost immediately began calling Warhol and Girodias and leaving threatening messages. She was arrested again in January 1969, and after further treatment at Bellevue Hospital, she returned to court and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. At the same time, ex-superstar Viva started demanding money and threatening to work against him. With all this going on, Warhol could easily have retreated into anxious seclusion, but he didn't. He may have slowed down a little, but he still had a big team around him and he still churned out the prints. But as well as bearing the visible scars of his surgery, Warhol had lasting mental scars. He was deeply affected by what happened, and the factory never again had quite the same openness and anarchic, we-can-do-anything creative buzz. In May 1969, he flew to Los Angeles to discuss a movie deal with Columbia Studios, a film version of The Truth Game by John Hallowell, a raunchy Hollywood exposé, but it didn't come off. Something else that really didn't come off was when he casually told a reporter, "I don't even do my own paintings, Bridget does them for me." Overnight, the value of his work plummeted as collectors panicked that their Warhols might not be Warhols, and he was forced to make a public retraction. In comparison to the white-hot energy and outrageousness of the 60s, the 1970s was a quieter decade for Warhol. The constant partying and the coming and going of superstars and wannabe superstars were much less. It was more a decade of consolidation. He was no longer doing commercial art, but spending a lot of time focusing on the commercial side of his fine art and other work. Licensing, commissions, and complex copyright issues, some of which were only resolved last year. There were difficulties with unauthorised printings of his works after a falling out between Warhol and some of his New York studio employees who went to Brussels to produce work stamped with "fill in your own signature." And he started offering portraits to anyone who could afford to pay $25,000, with additional canvases of the same image in a range of different colours for only $5,000 more. Celebrities queued up to get themselves immortalised, along with a succession of ageing worthies and socialites who were transformed into perfect, Canova-like specimens by Warhol, literally snipping away the wrinkles, bumps and imperfections from the negatives with a pair of scissors. In May 1971, his one and only play opened at La Mama Experimental Theatre in New York to unenthusiastic reviews. Based on over 200 hours of tape recordings made by Bridget Berlin of conversations with Warhol's friends about their sexual exploits, the play transferred to London, where critics described it as ridiculous from start to finish. At the same time, he had a retrospective at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Nothing new, Marilyns, electric chairs and cows, but the New York Times was ecstatic. Andy Warhol is, among other things, the world's coolest manipulator of borrowed material to induce disturbing responses in viewers less cool than himself. He occasionally agreed to do some album covers for friends and came up with the idea of using a real zip on the Rolling Stones album Sticky Fingers, which opened to reveal the model's underwear. Mick Jagger was a close friend and a big part of the factory scene in the Silver years. He loved the design. But it wasn't that practical, as it damaged the vinyl records when they were stacked, and it was a bit too hot for Franco's Spain, which insisted on a different image. He had another scare when two men arrived at the front desk of the factory, brandishing guns and demanding money and to see the famous Warhol. He managed to retreat into the editing room while his business manager, Fred Hughes, gave them some money. But undeterred, they grabbed Joe D'Alessandro's wife and baby and threatened to kill them unless Warhol came out. Unflappable as always, Joe appeared and calmly announced the police had been called and were already on their way, so they fled. And as if that wasn't bad enough, Valerie Solanas was released in September and almost immediately started sending threatening letters to all her old adversaries, and Howard Hughes of all people. In November 1971, Edie Sedgwick died. She had managed to achieve a brief period of being off substances and getting married, but she soon relapsed. The coroner classified her death as undetermined, possibly accidental, possibly deliberate, as she had alcohol and barbiturates in her system. Warhol didn't attend her funeral. 1972 was election year, and Warhol created his most overtly political work. Asked by the Democratic Party to produce a poster for George McGovern's campaign, he created this green-skinned, mad-eyed, foaming-at-the-mouth monster. It didn't do much to sway the voters, however, as Nixon won a famous landslide victory. Inspired by the press coverage of Nixon's trip to China earlier in the year, Warhol also embarked on a series of Chairman Mao portraits. When asked why, he said, "I've been reading so much about China. They're so nutty. They don't believe in creativity. The only picture they ever have is of Mao Zedong. It's great. It looks like a silkscreen." 10 years later, he visited China for himself, but his pictures of Mao have never been shown in the country. In August 1972, Andrea Feldman, one of Andy's superstars, who sometimes called herself Andrea Warholer, believing she was going to marry him, kept turning up with cigarette burns on her skin.
And Andy Warhol fell in love with me and asked me to be in one of his fabulous movies.
She had just finished making Heat and was going through a troubled period. "It's just a phase," Andy reassured everyone. But when she jumped to her death from a 14th floor apartment, saying she was going for the big time. It became clear it wasn't. And then, in November 1972, his mother died. She had lived with him in New York for almost 20 years, but when her health began to fail and she developed dementia, she went back to live with her other sons in Pittsburgh. One time she was found by the police wandering in the streets, and they only managed to get her home because the bottle of pills in her bag had her address on it. After another stroke, she ended up in a care home, where she eventually died. Although he called her often, Warhol did not visit her in the care home and did not attend her funeral. Nor did he mention her death to any of his friends or show any signs of grief. Even his live-in partner, Jed Johnson, didn't learn of her death until almost 3 years later. Whenever people asked about her, he would say, "Oh, she's great, but she doesn't get out of bed much," or "she's shopping at Bloomingdale's." In early 1973, he travelled back and forth to Rome while his movies Flesh for Frankenstein and Blood for Dracula were being shot at the famous Cinecittà studios. These were very different from his 60s films in that they had a plot, some proper actors, and they actually did quite well at the box office. I dutifully sat through Flesh for Frankenstein while researching this video. It has gathered quite a cult following, but personally, I don't think it's a patch on the Hammer horror films of the same period. And as for superstar Joe D'Alessandro's acting, well, it's not particularly superstar-like in my humble opinion. In April 1973, he was admitted to hospital with gallstones, and Valerie Solanas, in and out of psychiatric hospitals, continued to write troubling letters, saying she had a license to kill. Somehow, he continued to be productive, creating some nice, peaceful sunset pictures. In early 1974, he bought a new house for $310,000, which he paid for outright. He gave his partner Jed Johnson full freedom to design the interiors, and after years of cats, was persuaded to get a dog, Archie. His last picture at the Union Square factory was a portrait of his mother. And in September, he moved the whole enterprise to new premises on the other side of the square on Broadway. He installed a proper security system and took the bulletproof door he had invested in with him. At first, Warhol fretted about the large expanse of windows, worrying that people could see in and throw a rock or a bomb up from the street, as it was only on the 3rd floor. But he eventually relaxed and used the windowsill as his favourite place to sit and read the papers. After the move, he began to assemble his time capsules, boxes of apparently everyday objects that he meticulously collected for the rest of his life. He assembled over 600 of them in neat cardboard boxes. They contain everything from junk mail, fan letters, gallery invitation cards, unopened letters, solicitations for work, freebie records, a lump of concrete, explicit photos of various superstars' anatomy, thousands of stamps torn from envelopes and packets of sweets. Among the more interesting of the 300,000 objects are strips of photo booth snaps that are used to create many of his portraits, and some original works and textile designs he never exhibited. They are a treasure trove of art and biographical material, along with a few less savoury items that have presented the Warhol Museum with quite a preservation challenge: toenail clippings, dead ants, a mummified foot, and some used condoms. But the capsules were not random. He thought about what was going to go in and exactly where in the box he would place objects. Benjamin Liu, who was his personal assistant in making and sealing many of the boxes, and who was present at an unboxing of a capsule in the Warhol Museum in 2014, the last one to be opened, said, "It's not like he'd just throw stuff in. It was like, this goes here, this goes there." In 1975, he published The Philosophy of Andy Warhol, From A to B and Back Again, a ghost-written collection of anecdotes, reflections, and reminiscences about love, sex, beauty, fame, work, success, art, and death. based on taped interviews with Pat Hackett specifically for the book, and some of Bridget Berlin's other recordings of conversations. There are so many quotations I could use that reflect Warhol's unique view of the world, but I think his pronouncement on love possibly sums him up best. The biggest price you pay for love is that you have to have somebody around. You can't be on your own, which is always so much better. Another of his oft-quoted aphorisms in the book, making money is art, and working is art, and good business is the best art, was exemplified by him embarking on a 9-city US book promotion tour, followed by a trip to France, Italy, and last stop London. In 1976 he made his last film, Bad, directed by Jed Johnson, with no previous directorial experience. Warhol contributed a significant amount of money to the $1 million budget himself, and was closely involved in the production. It is a comedy about a ruthless woman who runs a beauty salon with a sideline in contract killing, specialising in the jobs others balk at, such as children. It didn't do well. Variety called it a compellingly revolting experience and an occasionally amusing outrage for the Warhol audience, but advised audiences to avoid going to see it after eating. In a diary entry from around this time, Warhol expressed fears that he had not produced any good art since he was shot, and that the critics seemed to be tiring of him, considering him to be no more than a society portraitist. So, searching for a new approach to reassert his position at the cutting edge of modern art, he began working on a new series of oxidation paintings, created by urinating or dripping other bodily fluids onto canvases prepared with copper or gold-coloured paint. These so-called piss paintings overlap with his torso and sex parts paintings, a series which began when he took a photo of someone boasting about the size of his appendage, most of which are too graphic for YouTube. I was curious to see whether his oxidation paintings reached the same prices as his other works, as I have to say, I'm not sure I would want somebody's bodily fluids running down my living room wall. In 2022, one of his Marilyns sold for $195 million, whereas a few years earlier, someone picked up this oxidation painting for a mere $1.9 million. In 1977, the famous, or infamous, Studio 54 opened, and Warhol soon became a regular. Hobnobbing with celebrities and rich patrons whom he persuaded to commission him to do their portraits, Mick Jagger, Liza Minnelli, John Lennon, Diana Ross, and Brigitte Bardot. The critics weren't impressed, calling them superficial, facile and commercial, with no depth or indication of the significance of their subjects. Undeterred, he continued with his Hammer and Sickle series, and his portraits of revered American athletes. In 1978, he did his Shadows series, and there were more portraits of Judy Garland and Muhammad Ali. The following year, he created the first of his reversal pieces, the same Marilyn publicity shot from her 1953 movie Niagara, but not quite the same. And that was pretty much the 70s. Very different to the previous decade. In the long shadow of Solanas, everything was a little cooler and more cautious. The open-door days of the factory, embracing anybody and everybody that turned up, were gone, and this seemed to turn down the heat of his creativity somewhat. By most people's standards, he still achieved an enormous amount. Dozens of pictures, a book, a play, films, building his glossy fashion, art and celebrity magazine Interview, and consolidating his brand. But the critics wanted more. So, how was Warhol, now in his 50s, going to deal with the rapidly changing world of the 1980s? In Europe, the emergence of a new style of painting had begun, Neo-Expressionism. A reaction to the conceptual art of the 70s, it returned to portraying recognisable objects, but often in an abstract, primitive, or emotionally violent way. In America, the rising stars were Jean-Michel Basquiat, Julian Schnabel, and David Salle. How was Warhol going to keep up with the new bloods? His exhibition of 10 portraits of Jews of the 20th century at the Jewish Museum in Manhattan was panned. The New York Times was particularly vicious. The show is vulgar, it reeks of commercialism, and its contribution to art is nil. The way it exploits its Jewish subjects without showing the slightest grasp of their significance is offensive, or would be anyway, if the artist had not already treated so many non-Jewish subjects in the same tawdry manner. In December 1980, he broke up with long-term partner Jed Johnson, but the next day he sent 27-year-old John Gould, who he had recently met, a dozen red roses. And again the next day, and every day for the next 2 weeks. Gould soon moved into Warhol's townhouse, and he was with him for the next 5 years. In 1981, Warhol worked on a project with radical theatre director Peter Sellers and Disney special effects wizard Alvaro Villa-Galvis to create a travelling stage show with a life-sized animatronic robot of Andy reading from his diaries. Warhol loved the project and is often quoted as saying, "I'd like to be a machine," in this context. But he actually said this way back in 1963 when talking about his art. "Paintings are too hard. The things I want to show are mechanical. Machines have less problems. I'd like to be a machine, wouldn't you?" Another oft-quoted saying, "I want to be plastic," is also frequently taken out of context. He was being interviewed about his films and about how the later ones have become more mainstream, more Hollywoodish. He said, "I love Los Angeles, I love Hollywood, they're beautiful. Everybody's plastic, but I love plastic. I want to be plastic." So, whatever else you may read, he never said he wanted to be a plastic robot. In 1983, he began working collaboratively with Jean-Michel Basquiat and rented him one of his buildings as a studio and place to live. Before the 1984 Sarajevo Winter Olympics, he was asked, along with 15 other artists, to contribute a work to honour the Games, and his speed skater picture was used for the official poster. There were more portraits, of course, and his Renaissance series, his Munch series, his Rorschach series, and in 1985, in a nod towards his earlier work, he produced his Ads series, based on common advertising symbols. In 1985, he had a joint exhibition with Basquiat at the Tony Shafrazi Gallery. But it got poor reviews, leaving him anxious about his next silkscreen series, Reigning Queens, as he worried that nobody in America was bothered about royalty, so he anticipated more bad reviews. His portraits may no longer have been setting the world on fire, but he didn't stop trying to stay current, and he hosted a talk show for MTV, Andy Warhol's 15 Minutes, featuring interviews with up-and-coming and established musicians, actors and writers that anticipated the fast-paced, non-linear, highly stylized rock video format by several years. In 1986, Mercedes-Benz commissioned Warhol to produce 80 pictures to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the invention of the motorcar. He completed 36 of these, but time was running out. Warhol had always been scared of catching colds and viruses, but even more scared of hospitals. The 80s was a particularly anxious time for the gay community, as people were dying from a mysterious new illness. In 1982, the CDC settled on a name, AIDS, and the following year, researchers at the Pasteur Institute in Paris isolated the virus. The first treatments became available in 1987, but it was several more years until effective treatment regimes were instituted. So when former partner John Gould died of an HIV-related illness in September 1986, Warhol was understandably concerned. In January 1987, he travelled to Milan for the opening of his last exhibition, Last Supper, based on Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece. Back in New York, he did portraits of Beethoven and even managed a bit of modelling with Miles Davis for a Cochin Sato fashion show. But he wasn't well. His old gallbladder problem had returned. He hadn't eaten properly for a month and had lost weight, as his intense fear of hospitals made him reluctant to do anything about it. When he finally agreed to surgery a week later, his gallbladder was gangrenous and fell apart in the surgeon's hands. The operation was longer than normal, as his surgeon also repaired the large abdominal hernia he had been left with after the shooting. But everything seemed to go well, and he was able to make calls from his room in the evening. In the middle of the night, however, he was found blue and unresponsive, and all efforts to resuscitate him failed. He was 58. His heart had gone into ventricular fibrillation and then arrested. There was criticism of his post-operative care, and a wrongful death lawsuit was settled out of court for $3 million. He was buried close to his parents in the Byzantine Catholic Cemetery in Pittsburgh. He left money to his brothers, but most of his estate, valued initially at $500 million, went to the Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. Most documentaries about Andy Warhol conclude with a substantial section about his influence on the world of art and on our wider culture generally. His legacy of thousands of paintings, drawings, films and other works is usually highlighted, as well as his lasting support for new artistic talent through the Warhol Foundation. But I'm not an art historian, I'm a psychiatrist, so I'll leave it up to you to decide whether he was a genius or an overhyped hack, or something in between. Whether you like his work or not, there is no denying that Andy Warhol changed the way we look at the world and what we think of as art. But I wanted to know where his ideas came from. What made him so different from everybody else? There is a well-known association between creativity and bipolar affective disorder, with many famous writers, artists and performers showing signs of this condition over the course of their lives, and often in their work as well. But in Warhol's case, there is no convincing evidence that he had any periods of sustained high or low mood. He had 2 or 3 periods which he called nervous breakdowns. One of these occurred after his mother returned to Pittsburgh for an extended stay in 1959, leaving him alone in New York and having to look after himself for the first time. But his assistant, Nathan Gluck, who was with him 5 days a week at this time, didn't notice anything different about him. He did go and see a psychiatrist, however, but gave up after a few sessions, finding it unhelpful. And when asked about psychiatry later, Warhol pointedly said, "It could help you if you don't know anything about anything." So, no obvious episodes of depression, but he did suffer from a lot of anxiety, worrying about all sorts of things, not having enough money, being unattractive, catching colds, someone trying to kill him, although that one was obviously understandable. He also had phobias. He was afraid of the dark his whole life. He hated hospitals, and early in his career he would cross America by car as he had a fear of flying. This one he managed to overcome, however, and he was able to jet around the world to open exhibitions in different countries. In the 1980s, at the start of the AIDS epidemic, he became increasingly anxious about his health and started seeing a chiropractor who specialised in treating stress, Dr. Andrew Bernson, who also got him into crystals. He started wearing a crystal pendant around his neck to tune him into the cosmos, as he felt crystals were full of life force and healing power. He also started eating raw garlic to the extent that associates would complain the smell was unbearable at times, especially when mingled with the heavy perfumes he liked to wear. Some people have suggested that he had a body dysmorphic disorder, as he was convinced his nose was ugly. But I don't agree. He had a genuine skin condition, rhinophyma, that required regular treatment to keep it in check, rather than any distorted beliefs about his appearance. And While we are thinking about possible psychiatric diagnoses, we should consider the issue of his sexuality. Some of Warhol's own pronouncements on the subject have to be taken with a very large pinch of salt. For example, his claim that he was still a virgin when interviewed in his 50s. He may not have declared himself publicly as gay, but neither did he make any efforts to hide his sexuality. And we have to remember that homosexuality was still considered to be a form of mental illness by the American Psychiatric Association right up until 1973, and was illegal in some US states until 2003. Another diagnosis that has been suggested for Warhol is narcissistic personality disorder. The argument goes that he was vain and deeply insecure, always seeking approval and affirmation, that he had difficulty in forming long-term relationships and had only 2 lifetime goals: to be the most famous artist of the 20th century and to become very rich. He lacked empathy, discarded friends and associates, and was miserly, underpaying his factory associates or not paying them anything at all. The counter-argument is that he was warm and considerate and generous to family members, and that he did sustain a 12-year relationship with Jed Johnson. And of course he wanted to be the best artist he could be and become rich. Who wouldn't? Having read a lot of personal recollections about Warhol over the past few weeks, it seems to me that he could present different sides of his personality to different people. There are certainly lots of anecdotes about his selfishness and tendency to make use of people, but there are an equal number saying he was sweet and kind. So for me, the case for him having a narcissistic personality disorder is not convincing. So, what did he have? In my video on his early years, I talked about Warhol's illness at the age of 8, rheumatic fever complicated by Sydenham's chorea, an autoimmune movement disorder that is often accompanied by behavioural changes, especially obsessive-compulsive behaviour, and how this can affect people for the rest of their lives. There is sometimes confusion over obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD, and obsessive-compulsive behaviour, or OCB. In Warhol's case, there is abundant evidence of the latter. He would listen to the same record 100 times in a day, wear the same clothes all the time, and never throw anything away. When he died, only 2 rooms of his townhouse were habitable. The rest were crammed with things he just had to keep. 100,000 things. Many never even taken out of the packaging. And much of the stuff he accumulated in his studios, he had assistants place in cardboard boxes and called it art. Or rather, other people called it art. He called them time capsules. For anyone else, this would be hoarding. The only thing that makes it different is that he was wealthy enough to pay for other people to box it up and had enough space to store it. Otherwise, it would have been identical to the unsorted piles of junk and rotting food that clutter hoarders' homes around the world. And there is the issue of his underwear. He devotes a whole chapter to buying underwear in The Philosophy of Andy Warhol, saying, amongst other things, "My favourite thing to buy is underwear. I think buying underwear is the most personal thing you can do. And if you could watch a person buying underwear, you would really get to know them. I mean, I would rather watch somebody buy their underwear than read a book they wrote." He then goes on to describe a shopping trip to Macy's with a friend, rejecting suggestions that they try somewhere new and insisting on reading the entire packaging and washing instructions to make sure they had not changed in any way before buying 30 identical pairs of jockey briefs. This obsessive-compulsive behaviour could have been related to his childhood rheumatic fever, or it could have been part of an autistic spectrum disorder. The suggestion that Warhol was autistic was made over 20 years ago. The evidence said to support this include his obsessional behaviour, his flat, unvarying tone of voice, his peculiar speech, and difficulty processing other people's speech, his often monosyllabic answers to questions when interviewed, his complete single-mindedness and focus on his work, his cringing from physical contact and his preference for fixed routines, and also the repetition in his art. The Irish psychiatrist and autism expert Professor Michael Fitzgerald also highlighted his difficulties making friends in childhood and preference for books and radio programs over playing with other children, and that, as an adult, he was described as being like a 6-year-old child, as he was so naive and fragile, and that he showed a lack of empathy with people. Attempting to make diagnoses on historical figures who have not been personally examined is often criticised. I absolutely agree that any diagnostic formulations have to be treated with caution, especially when considering autism, which can be a difficult condition to diagnose even when somebody is sitting in front of you. And it is even more difficult in someone who, as a modern artist, was known for being alternative and who may well have exaggerated some of his behaviours for the press. This is one of the reasons I spend a lot of time reading about people before they were famous, because that is usually when they are at their least affected. With all that said, I do believe there is a strong case for concluding that Andy Warhol probably had an autistic spectrum disorder. When this theory was put to a former curator of the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, he was strongly opposed to thinking of Warhol as impaired in any way. This was some time ago, and it reflects outmoded thinking about autism as an impairment, rather than as neurodiversity, or just being different. I know a lot of people find it a struggle to think of their artistic heroes as autistic, but if you forget about the word and all of its baggage, and think of neurodiversity as a different way of sensing, processing, and thinking about the world, then that surely is the very essence of artistic originality. And I think it was Andy Warhol's autism that made him so different from everybody else. I'll finish with a wonderful quote about Warhol's enigmatic personality by Truman Capote, the man he once unnerved with his attention, but who later became a friend. He was a sphinx without a riddle. Perhaps the riddle was that he was autistic. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this journey into the life of one of the 20th century's most intriguing artists. There are some very good biographies about him, which I'll add to my Amazon store page if you're interested. But I found the Warhol Stars website a fascinating source of information. It's full of personal accounts from the people who knew him, and I would thoroughly recommend it. And if you found this one interesting, please check out some of my other videos on artists: Vincent van Gogh, Frida Kahlo, Francisco Goya, Richard Dadd, and Louis Wayne. As always, I'd love to hear your views, and I'll respond to as many as I can. And if you have any suggestions for who I should do next, please let me know. Please remember to subscribe if you haven't already done so, and click for notifications. But apart from that, I'll say goodbye for now, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.